It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Dr. Romeo Vecht. We're here in your beautiful apartment in St. John's Wood in London. And Romeo, I've just been looking at the pictures that you have on the wall and just hearing a little bit about your incredible story of your family. Something out of the unbelievable.
Yeah, we're lucky to be here.
So if you could just...
We're lucky to be here.
We really are. If you could just relate to us a little bit about your family.
I'll have to go to the beginning. The family were Dutch for centuries, and they were mainly agricultural people living in the north of Holland. And my grandfather, Dr. Vecht, was married to Bernardine Koopman van den Berg. Now, Zadok van den Berg was a religious Jew who invented margarine in Holland in the 1830s at a big factory, and my grandfather, having married into the family, was sent to London to introduce margarine in England. And they, although they were both Dutch, they were married in Whitechapel, and I've seen the document, and they were married around about 1875. And margarine was not wanted by the farmers here, so he had to do something else. In the meantime, he joined the Zionist movement, Chov Zion and that sort of stuff, and he became quite a personality in London. He knew a lot of people. I've got pictures to show you. And eventually, around about 1890, they left to Australia. And in Australia he started, because of the family, they were all butchers, whatever, and he started a big meat business in Australia and New Zealand. And he was a very religious man. He was a shochet, and he had a Sefer Torah produced, which I still have, which is maybe 150 years old now. We've had it redone in Israel, and it's kosher, and we use it for bar mitzvahs and things like that. And I must just tell you, I want to divert a minute. Just recently there was an article in the Jewish Chronicle, a tiny little article, describing a rabbi coming over from Australia to meet the chief rabbi around 1900. The chief rabbi was Herman Adler, with the question of when is the meat to be koshered? At the time of slaughter, before it's frozen. In those days it was 6 weeks by ship to England, or after arriving. And my grandfather then had shilas to the rabbinate at the time, and the halakha to this day is that you have to kosher the meat within 3 days of slaughter. That is water and salt. And then you can freeze it, and it's kosher on arrival. On the other hand, if you send it by ship, refrigerate it, not koshered, the only way you can kosher it on arrival is doing a barbecue, like you would do a liver kosher. And my father was the youngest of about, I think, 11. 2 died. He was the youngest.
I think you have a picture, in Australia.
Which I will show you in a minute. It's not here. And he, in those days, it was a British Empire. Australia was British, so my father was born British. And this is how we survived the Holocaust. I'll come to that in a minute. Grandfather died young. He was a very famous Zionist. I'll show you things to do with that. He introduced Zionism in Australia. I've seen the book referring to that. All this was 1995, something like that. And then after...
1895.
1895, sorry. 1895. And 1900 they left and they lived in Cape Town for a while. And he befriended Cecil Rhodes, and he had a business with the Bears. He was quite an entrepreneur, to be honest. And from there he went to Argentina, always to do with meat. And there's a big article in the Jewish Chronicle of the time, which I will show you, where he describes the poverty of the Jewish people in Argentina, so poor that they could not afford to buy kosher meat. So he intervened in some way or other. Then he went to live in Antwerp. Why Antwerp? I presume because of the harbour. It was the big harbour in Europe in those days. And then he died suddenly after a gallbladder operation in 1908 in Antwerp, probably from an infection. And his last wish was to be buried in Ottoman Palestine. And so his elder son, who was known as Moses Montefiore, after Montefiore, took the body, and he was buried in Trumpeldor, which is a cemetery in the middle of Tel Aviv. In 1909, it was outside Tel Aviv.
I've actually been. It's really in
and all the big signage, Bialik and all these people out there. And I went to see his grave many times. And he was a very wealthy man. He did very well out of this business. So that's the background. And I've got some documents to show you.
Is that the picture of?
No, I'll come to it. No. It's the other room. Right, so now my father lived in Antwerp. My father lost his father when he was 8 years old. And he became a banker. And he was also in advertising. And in 1940, the Germans invaded. And I remember very clearly, I was about 4 years old. I was sleeping at night and I heard these bombers flying over. And they were bombing the harbour. And I remember that, I'll never forget that. And as a child, I remember thinking to myself, that man Hitler's up there.
You already knew the name?
Yes. And at 6 in the morning, on a Friday morning, my mother came into my room and said, Romy, we're having to go away. And the whole family, there were dozens of the Freudmans. You know, the Freudmans of the Vechts were related to two Vecht daughters married to Freudman brothers. They all escaped, except my family. And the reason why my family were not able to escape was because my mother, was born in Krakow, which was then Austrian. And she came over to Belgium when she was a baby with her father, who was called Kalman Binnenzucht. He was a misnugget, very frum, and he had an Austrian passport. So when the family, everybody fled to Dunkirk, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
And because my grandfather had an Austrian passport, the French wouldn't let him in. So we wasted 2 weeks at the border. There was no petrol. The only petrol my father could get was from British regiments, and they would give us what they had. We got to Dunkirk, and my father saw some soldiers in green uniform. And he asked somebody, are these Dutch paratroopers? And the guy said, no, they're German paratroopers. And so we were taken prisoner. And then a number of miracles happened, literally miracles. My father had polio in Australia, so he had a bit of a weak leg. And he went to, with my mother of course, to a Belgian doctor in Antwerp, where we lived. And he said, look, I'm very ill. He'd been prisoner of the Germans for 3 months before we could locate him. He was taken away with the rest of the British Expeditionary Force. A lot of soldiers were taken prisoner in Dunkirk. And my father was taken along with them. And he became the translator of the British Army for the Germans. He could speak many languages. And my mother eventually located him, got him out, and we went to this doctor.
Can I ask, where did you go when you were separated?
We went back to Antwerp with my mother, and I remember spending a night in a German barrack with soldiers. We were prisoners.
And
British
did you have any
prisoners.
siblings at this time?
My sister, who died recently. And we were taken there, and eventually we went back. My mother went back to the flat, which was sealed off by the Belgian concierge downstairs, and she'd taken all the silver, everything away. But we got it back. That's another story. Anyhow, and she went to this Belgian doctor. My father was hypertensive. He was a very tall man, but he wasn't a healthy man. And this doctor gave a letter, which I have somewhere, where he says, Mr. Philip Vecht is a very ill person and needs to have a cure. And I recommend that he goes to Spa. Spa is it's the spa of all the spas in Belgium, where people go for cures and hot water and this and that. And the Germans accepted that. And every year, the Gestapo and the Kommandantur, they came round. We weren't allowed to move. We weren't allowed to travel, nothing. We had to live in that little thing, a little city, next to the German barracks, where the German soldiers were. And every week they would come and check on us. And this went on for 4 years. Now, in that period, a number of Jewish people were hidden in that room. Let me tell you that the Germans didn't start deporting Jews until, I think, the end of 1941 or beginning of 42. And around about that, just a few months before that happened, people realized that they were going to be in trouble with the Germans, and they started hiding with Goyish families. Some kids went to monasteries and so on. And by the time the Americans arrived, at the end of 44, most of the Jews who were hidden had been taken away. A few survived. Now, amongst the people who were hidden away were 2 Freudman families, and we were related to the Freudmans. One was Ferdi Freudman, and the other was Jules Freudman. And I remember 2 things. One, Ferdi Freudman had a family. He had, I think, 2 boys and 2 girls. And the eldest boy was Herbert. And he had a clandestine bar mitzvah. And I went there as a kid. Maybe I was 5 or 6 years old. But I remember the event. It was all hidden away. And Ferdi decided that it was unsafe to stay there, and he and his family tried to get away by going to the south of France, which was Vichy, where the Germans weren't overactive at some stage. But he was caught and never seen again, although his wife and the kids survived. But Herbert, I have a photo of him, joined the American Army or something. I've got a photo of him in American uniform, but he disappeared, and we don't know. The other Freudman who was there was Jules. He was, I think, a diamond dealer, and he was there with his wife, and I think 2 daughters, if I remember well, and they survived. They survived the war, as we did.
Well, you were in this, in a way, hiding, but while you were in
No, we were openly, I've got the papers, Jüdische Britische Familie Vecht. All the documents. I've got them, I'll show you.
Were you ever hungry, or did you have food? Or
Well, we were lucky because that part of Belgium is very anti-German, unlike Flanders, which is pro-German. So Antwerp was in the Flanders, and there were a lot of anti-Semites. Down south, the Walloon people were French-speaking. There were lots of farms. And so my father used to buy butter and milk and vegetables. Of course, there was no kosher food. So my father didn't eat meat, and my mother didn't. We were forced to eat meat because the doctor said the kids were anemic. So once a week we had the pleasure of eating treif.
And Robbie, can I ask, do you remember the reunion when your father came back after those?
No. It was all clandestine. It was all hidden away. I just remember my father being there one day.
And what did you do during the day when you were?
I was a kid. I was playing in the park. There were there was no action against Jews.
Was there any school that you could go? Or?
No, I was too young for school. But when the Germans started deporting Jews, then life changed. And in Spa, which is a nice little city, I remember very clearly, in the park it said Jews not allowed. In the cinema, Jews not allowed, in French, of course. And then, why am I called Romeo? You must ask yourself.
It's a little unusual, that's true.
There were Romies in my family. Romy. And I was called Romy. And as soon as I was born, in 1935, my father went to the British Embassy. My Hebrew name is Abraham. Well, that didn't go down because Hitler was around the corner. So they called me Romy. And the woman at the embassy said, "I'm sorry, sir, we don't know that name. You have to think of another one." So within 2 minutes, they thought up, well, you have Romeo. And, that's the way it is. So we lived in Spa. You asked me about food. Strangely, there was a distant cousin of my mother called David Pruver, who was hidden in Liège, which is the big city in Wallonia, quite a few miles away. And he was able to come once a week, and he was shecht a chicken. He would do, and my father wouldn't allow me to watch it. He didn't know I was going to be a doctor. He said, you're too agitated when you see these things. And the other thing which happened, all my father could do was write poetry and read and teach me English. And one day he went, there's a big lake there, beautiful lake, and he saw an angler, and the guy took out a big fish, and then unhooked it and threw it back. So my father said to him, "What was that fish you just chucked back?" He said, "Oh, that's a carp. We don't eat carp." For the rest of the war, for 4 years, we had carp every Friday Shabbat. So that was our protein. They don't eat carp, they don't know it. And I remember very clearly, on Friday there was a carp swimming in the bathroom. That was the carp story. Anyhow, then the Americans turned up.
Can I just ask before we go into why did they decide to save your family? That you got this special dispensation?
I can tell you that. First of all, the British government knew that we were prisoners. They knew it. And the British had German prisoners, right? And so, first of all, my father's passport was renewed. That's another story, I'll tell you about that. Second of all, through the Red Cross and through my mishpacha in London, we had, through the Red Cross via Portugal, which was neutral, we used to get tins of sardines every month. So much so that, if I look at a sardine, you know what I mean, right? So that was all the documents were British Judische Familie, and my father always used to say, had the war lasted another 6 months, our term would have come. We would have ended up in Auschwitz. They had a problem with English and American prisoners, Jewish. They had a problem. They didn't, because the Allies had German prisoners.
So maybe they could.
And now I'll tell you a story about that. Round about end of 41, a Jewish woman appeared. We lived comfortably in a villa at first, a villa which my parents had hired before the war, so they knew the landlord. And she was a governess, a Jewish governess to a Jewish family in Hamburg. And she escaped, came to Belgium, heard there was a Jewish family still thriving, if I may say so. And so she offered her services. And her name was Fräulein Ehrensweig. She was very tough with me, but I knew she loved me. And I was 7 years old, so this is 1942, and she taught me to read and write French, Hebrew, maths, because I wasn't allowed to go to school. Jewish children weren't allowed to go to school. So she taught me, and I remember her very well, and I thought she was in her 50s. And one day she came in after maybe 6 months or a year. She came in with a letter from the Gestapo ordering her to go back to Germany for war effort, to work in a ammunition factory. And she said she was allowed to take a suitcase and a pair of boots. I remember that. I was listening. And my father said to her, Fräulein Ehrensweig, stay here. We'll keep you here, we'll hide you. No, she said. I'm a German, nothing will happen. She disappeared, of course, never to be seen again. Now I want to tell you something interesting about this. When I was working in, I did 5 years in an Israeli hospital after I retired here. I worked at Haifa, Carmel Hospital, very good. And I was in contact with the Holocaust people in Yerushalayim.
Yad Vashem?
In the Yad Vashem. And somehow or other I got hold of lists of people, and I looked up Fräulein Ehrensweig. Okay? And there she was. Rosa Ehrensweig, age 34, 32. Governess. Born in Budapest. Worked in Hamburg, ended up with a Jewish family in Belgium, deported to Malines. Malines was the place where the Jews were assembled prior to the trains to Auschwitz. She was in the first Belgian convoy, the first one to leave Belgium. And it took me 75 years to find out exactly who she was and what happened to her.
She was only 35.
I'm sorry?
She was only 35. She wasn't...
less, 32 or 33. I, as a kid, I thought she was in her 50s. That's one of these, one of these war stories. Anyhow, during those years, unknown to us children, my father was approached by the Belgian resistance. And he accepted to work for them because there was an organization throughout Europe to fly back shot pilots. Some little plane would land in somewhere in a forest. I think the plane was called a Lysander. And the resistors would show them the spotlights where to land and when to land, and then a few pilots would jump out of the bush and into the plane. It was very important to repatriate pilots. They didn't care about planes. Planes are planes, but pilots you need. They were trained boys. And so he was busy translating messages from London to the Belgian boys. Nobody spoke English. And my father was an intellect. He was a poet, brilliant chap, if I may say so. And suddenly he started gardening. And he would come in the house with carrots and this and beetroot and God knows what. And my mother and I, she didn't tell us, but the Belgian resistance were putting ammunition in the back of our garden, thinking it was safe, that Germans would never think that this Jewish guy would behave like that. Hence that document, which he received after the war from General Eisenhower, thanking him for helping the Allies win the war. So you can take a picture of that when you want.
Is it at all possible for you to read the document? Because it's very, very special.
You read it.
It's it is something unbelievable. So this is from the Allied Expeditionary Force, the Office of the Supreme Commander, in order of the day. And that would be wonderful if you could read it. It is, so I think it's something extraordinary.
Right. I need to bring it back. Now that the soil of Belgium is almost liberated, I wish as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces to pay sincere tribute to the officers and men of the Resistance group who, in carrying out my orders, have fought so magnificently. They can be justly proud of having, by their devoted heroism, contributed so largely to the liberation of their beloved homeland. The rapidity of the advance of the Allied forces, which has spared much of your country the horrors of war, has been due in no small measure to your help. I salute especially your honored dead and wounded. The success which has attended our arms has led us out of Belgium into other theatres of operations. Fighting is therefore over for most of you as soldiers of resistance groups. This does not necessarily mean that your services are no longer needed. The war is being carried into the enemy's country, and if you are required by your government to continue the struggle as members of the regular Belgian armed forces, I shall be proud to have you once more under my command. Meanwhile, in my capacity of Supreme Commander, I wish to say to the soldiers of the resistance groups that those of them who are no longer engaged in fighting or on guard duties, etc., upon orders of the Allied commanders, can best assist the military effort by handing in their arms to their authorities and awaiting their instructions as to how they can best play their part in the struggles ahead. These arms are urgently needed for other purposes. Until hostilities cease, all activities, whether in the workshop or at the front, must be directed against our common enemy. Signed, Dwight Eisenhower, addressed to Vecht Philip.
And it's dated
2nd October 1944. Okay?
But it is something unbelievable.
Now, what this document doesn't tell you is that, I have to go back a bit. This is the day the Americans arrived in Spa on a Sunday, September the 10th, 1944, I jumped on a tank and was quickly dressed up as a GI. And these are two soldiers who belonged to the 1st US Army. And that was a jeep. And this was a little crowd of people in the center of Spa. That is my late mother. That is my sister. And that is the Belgian girl, Michelle de Batty, who was about 18 or 20, who helped my mother. Right? So I have to tell you that one. And it's very important that I mention Michelle de Batty. I'll tell you why in a minute. The war was not over because...
I just want to have a closer view because this picture is absolutely unbelievable.
Okay. Now, what happened next? When the Americans heard there was a Jewish family still alive, on Rosh Hashanah, which was a week or two after the liberation, we had about 30 Jewish GIs in the house, and for the first time we had kosher meat, and I heard the shofar for the first time, and they were laning, and 30 GIs, all Jews. And the chaplain was a captain called Maurice Frank. And one day he called me to his office. He said, "Romeo, I'm going to give you a present." I was 9 years old, just about 9. "I'm going to give you a present." And he gave me a bag containing tefillin made for American GIs. He said, "When you're bar mitzvah, I want you to wear those." And you know what? I still wear them.
It's unbelievable.
It's going back a few years. They're getting a bit worn, but he asked me and I kept my promise.
Wow.
But what I didn't tell you, this is September, October, November. 3 months later, now we had these Jewish soldiers coming in and out, bringing us food and all the things that the army had. And 3 months later, the Germans came back. That was the Battle of the Bulge. And one of the guys who came in one day, his name was Alexander, he was the chef of the regiment. He said, "You've got to leave. The Germans are heading towards Spa." And we left again on the Shabbos, on a Friday night, and we drove through terrible conditions. It was snowing like hell. This is why they attacked. And we crossed American reinforcement coming in. And I remember seeing an American tank flying over into a river, That was the Battle of the Bulge. And then after that, my father decided I have to learn about Yiddishkeit. And so I was sent to the Hasmonean, which was then a boarding school in London, run by Rabbi Schoenfeld.
Now this happened after the war?
Immediately after the war, and I spent a year, just about a year.
Can I just ask, your recollections of D-Day or when the war ended, do you recall?
Oh yes.
It must have been...
First of all, the Germans fled. A week before the Americans arrived, these Americans, by the way, had landed in Normandy.
Mm-hmm.
So they found all their way, and the next move was into Germany. And I remember the Jewish boys asking my mother, how far are we from the Siegfried line? Because they were terrified of crossing the Siegfried line. And then this Battle of the Bulge came, and thousands of Jewish soldiers were killed.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most wonderful stories which I read, and I still think about it, about 1,000 GIs were taken prisoner in one spot somewhere in Belgium. And they were lined up, and the commandant came up to the the guy who took over, the sergeant. He's named in Yad Vashem, by the way. I can't remember his name. And he called the sergeant. He said, "You're looking after all these prisoners. I want you to get the Jewish boys to come forward." And the American sergeant said, "Sorry, I can't do that." He said, he took his gun out, and he said, "I want you to call out the Jewish soldiers." There were about 80 of them out of 1,000. He said, "I'm not going to do that. And I'll tell you something, Herr Kommandant. After the war, if you kill me, you'll be hanged." He said, "In any case, all these soldiers are Jews."
Wow.
He saved a lot.
That's incredible.
Anyhow, that's it. So, that's it.
Can I just ask, when the war ended, when did you, I know you're still very young, but when did you get to know about the horrors of
I'll tell
the
you.
camps?
I'll tell you. My father had a big business before the war in Antwerp. Around about 1942-43, one of these guys who worked for my father, who was known as Aaron Hollander in Antwerp, he jumped out of a train. He broke his ankle, but he knew that we were in Spa. So he walked for miles and miles, and he arrived, and my father hid him somewhere with a non-Jewish family, and he told us what was happening. He knew that once you were on the train, it was Auschwitz, because some people, I don't know, he knew it, so we knew it. And the funny story about him, my father and he were big chess players. And the little bungalow where we lived had a terrace overlooking the street. And they were shouting at each other. And I said to my mother, "What language are they shouting in, playing chess?" Kibitzen, you know what it is.
Yeah.
And my mother, "This is Luxembourgish." It was Yiddish, of course. What I remember about the actual arrival of the Americans is that the Germans left. And I must tell you, for 4 years, we'd been under occupation, and you never saw a drunk German or a badly uniformed German. They were pretty regimented. And we didn't know what was going on in Auschwitz then. But where they were occupying, the Wehrmacht, they didn't give us trouble. It was the Kommandatur and the Gestapo. They were the nasty ones. And I used to watch them doing their exercises and singing in the streets on their horses. And my father gave me a dog. And the dog, he called him Tommy. Tommy's a British soldier, right?
Yeah.
And I used to walk the dog, and the German soldiers we were very dark, my sister and I were very dark, and they thought we were Italian kids. So there was strikers and, "Ach, schön, wie heißt der Hund?" And I used to say, "Tommy, nicht gut, nicht gut." Little stories like that. But anyhow, the Germans left, and on the Shabbos afternoon, we were told the loudspeakers to leave our houses because they were blowing up the bridges and the railway, and I remember that. And we lived miles away from the train station, and a piece of metal, a bit of rail, flew up into our back garden. I'll never forget this. And then that Shabbos afternoon, I remember seeing planes in the distance firing at tanks. So it was German planes firing at American tanks. The next morning at 6 o'clock on Sunday morning, this girl Michel de Batty. She came running to the house, 6 o'clock in the morning. She said, Romeo, Romeo, les Américains sont là. The Americans are here. And she grabbed me and we ran down the hill. And at the bottom of the hill, in a valley, I saw my first American soldier. That was the first time I saw a soldier in khaki, as opposed to green. He was standing in a jeep. The first time I saw a jeep with a white star. And he was on a walkie-talkie. Now, my father taught me English, right? So there were a few Belgian people there. Nobody spoke English. So I spoke to this guy. He was very handsome. I remember, tanned. He had a disease of his mouth, I thought. You know, I was always going to be a doctor. He had something wrong with his... And I spoke to him, and he replied, couldn't understand a word. He was a deep Southern American, couldn't understand. But he was... And I thought, my God, something, he's been hit by a bullet or something. But of course he was chewing a gum.
Ah, you never seen...
No, of course not. The first chewing gum I was given, I swallowed it. We didn't know. And then he was on one of these phones, big thing. And within minutes, tanks came out from every field. He was just a scout, making sure there were no Germans. And then the tanks came out. I jumped on a tank, and I was given chocolate, which I'd never seen, and things like that. And then they drove into the city, and my mother was waiting there. And they quickly dressed me up with a uniform.
Can we just show the picture again? It's
You wanna see it
iconic.
again?
This is the most iconic picture. It's unbelievable. And this picture, was this in many newspapers and
I don't know.
newsreels?
I have no idea. Tell me when you finish.
Okay, it's amazing. Thank you so much.
And so...
And it's dated. You have the date, September.
Yeah. No, I put that in.
Ah, okay.
I put that in.
Yeah. But it was on September
September the 10th,
1944.
1944.
Wow. And how long were you with American soldiers before?
Oh, I must have been there a few months. Until the Battle of the Bulge, 3 months. Then we had to flee. And as a matter of fact, they didn't come as far as Spa. If you go to Spa one day, it's a fascinating place. There's a big rock just outside Spa where it says the German offensive was stopped at this spot. The Americans fought heroically. They were completely... 250,000 German soldiers and hundreds of tanks suddenly pierced. And it was Hitler's last gamble. The idea was to split Belgium in two, take Antwerp, which was the harbour where all the stuff was coming in from England to support the troops, and split the British North and the American South and win the war. That was his plan. He almost made it. He could have made it. And they didn't make it because they ran out of fuel. And they were banking on grabbing American depots, but the Americans blew them up. So they had no petrol. No petrol, no tanks.
It's amazing.
It was the last big battle of the war. And then from there they went into Germany, and there's a big cemetery somewhere there, and I went with Noemi years later, and it's full of Magen David, full of Jewish boys. I think 40,000 Americans lost their lives in that battle. It's horrific. Now, I want to come back to Michel de Batty, because when my youngest boy, Joshua, was bar mitzvah, we tracked her in Belgium. By then she was a woman in her 60s. And she came. And she gave me a letter, which I have somewhere. I don't know if I can find it tonight, but anyhow. And it was an eye-opener, and I'll tell you why. Somewhere in July 1944, D-Day was June, right? Somewhere in the middle of July, there was a row between my parents at night. And they had never rowed in all their lives. And the next morning I asked what was going on, and they had received a letter from the Gestapo, or the Kommandatur, offering an exchange of prisoners in mid-channel. In other words, we would be exchanged against Germans in 2 ships in the middle of the channel. And my father was British, and he said, yeah, I'll go for it. And my mother, who was Polish, she said, you can't trust the Germans. And we didn't go. She comes to the bar mitzvah. He was born in 74, so bar mitzvah would have been 87 years. So many years after this picture. And she sat down. The chief rabbi Jakobovitz was there. Big oilem, big bar mitzvah. And she started singing the mirrors, which she had heard as children. And the benching,
She remembered.
She remembered the Hebrew words.
A non-Jewish lady. For sure. Wow. And she remembered after all these years?
All these years. And she started singing. People couldn't believe it. And then she gave me a letter. Right? Dated round about the 15th of July from the German headquarters, allowing Michel de Batty to travel with British Jewish family Vecht to the port of Ostend for a prisoner exchange. It was a true bill. We could have saved ourselves 3 months of agony. My mother wouldn't have it, but they did exchange prisoners.
And she had that letter?
I've got it.
It's amazing.
That's the story. And that's where it ends.
So I just want to, if you could just show the pictures of your dear parents, and
right,
because this is something really special.
These are my grandparents, Aaron Vecht and Bernardine Koopman-Vandenberg, married in London 1875 or something, in Whitechapel, both Dutch. They went to Australia, to South Africa, to the Argentines, and eventually ended up in Antwerp. My grandfather died age 54 in 1908 and is buried at Trumbeldor, and my grandmother died in Antwerp in 1926. Right, now these are my parents. Zichrono Levrocho. My father, he was born in Sydney in 1899. He died in Antwerp in 1968. My mother was born in Krakow in 1900 and died in London in 1985. And they survived the war and supported us to the extent that on one occasion, in the middle of the war, my sister and I and my parents, we went to a convent or a monastery, one of these places, and I remember I was taken aback by the size of this church and the monks and the priests looking after us, and we didn't know what we were doing there. We just had a visit. And of course, after the war, my parents told me that, you know, if the parents had been taken by the Germans, we children would have been saved by the priests. And I'm telling you that because my sister, who died just before Pesach last year, she was younger than me. After the war, she worked for an organization, I think it was called the Joint. And her job was to go around all the monasteries in Belgium looking for Jewish kids. She rescued some.
This was your sister?
My sister. She rescued some and kept in contact for years and years, but some wouldn't come. They were adopted, Christian, lost. She did this for a number of years. Yeah.
Wow.
That's the story.
Romeo, I just have to ask you, you know, it's amazing going through what your parents and what you and your sister went through. It really is miracles, incredible miracles.
It was a miracle.
But your parents, they always kept their emunah, their faith.
So much so, I think I told you at the beginning, my grandfather had a Sefer Torah because he traveled around the world, this guy. And my father, being the youngest, inherited the Sefer Torah. And he had it hidden in the house where we lived. And my father always used to say, wherever we go, we take the Sefer Torah. And he believed that that's what saved us.
And you mentioned that the lady, she took the silver and you managed to get it back.
Yes.
You went back to your home in
No, he had the Sefer Torah with him in Spa.
In Spa. He had it hidden. I mean.
And when the Battle of the Bulge came and we fled, he took the Sefer Torah. And he always believed that Sefer Torah saved us. I then inherited it. And it was a tradition for every bar mitzvah boy in the family to read out of that Sefer. And in the end, I gave it to my son, who's got our house in Israel. I bought a house in Kezaria, and he's got it now, and the Sefer.
And it's in Israel, the Sefer Torah.
And when I lived in Israel for 5 years, we had a minyan in the house because the synagogue wasn't quite right. I didn't get on with the people. So we had a minyan and we used the Sefer.
And can I ask, after you left Spa, did you go back to Antwerp to...
No, I told you, to the Hasmonean school in London.
No, but your parents, they went back to...
They went back. My father started from scratch.
Did they go back to the same apartment that they had before?
No.
And how did they get the silver, or how did they get your belongings?
Some charwoman who worked for my mother took it, kept it, and gave it back to us.
She gave it back?
Every bit.
And your parents started again from...
My father started from zero. He had to repay the British government because they were sending us money during the war. And he started from scratch.
And he was determined that you'd have a film education, so he sent you to England.
He sent me 2 years to the Yesodei HaTorah, very frum. The problem I had there was that they taught Gemara in Yiddish. So first of all, I had to learn Yiddish. So it didn't work out for me.
And your recollections of Rabbi Schoenfeld, because he was also very instrumental in saving...
Oh, saved
he was, they say thousands, literally
maybe thousands. I saw him there very well. He was an imposing figure, tall man with a big beard, but very sweet. No, I spent nearly a year there.
And you were happy there?
No, I was very miserable. I was very homesick.
It must have been very difficult.
But it made me what I became. Sure of myself, independent. And I knew I was going to be a cardiologist early on, and it just helped me to live away from my parents because they stayed in Antwerp and I came to study in England.
And where did you study medicine?
I'm sorry?
Where did you study medicine?
In Bristol. In those days, I'm talking late 50s, it was very difficult for a Jewish boy to get into a London medical school. There was numerous classes. They've never recognized this, but I know now. And I was going to go, I gave up. I tried getting 12 medical schools and I was rejected 12 times. And then I asked my father if I could go to either Paris or Geneva. And I was accepted in both, but I thought Paris with all the museums and things, will I study seriously? And Geneva was too expensive. And at that stage there was a Jewish boy, a friend of mine, and we were doing A-levels together. Now he was as English as they came. He wasn't from, but he was very Jewish. His family were very from, and he'd been 2 years in the Royal Air Force, and he could not get into a medical school in London. Purely British, served in the forces, and I thought to myself, well, if he can't get in, I'm not going to get in. I come from Belgium. And one day he phoned me up, he said, have you tried Bristol? I said, where's Bristol? You know, could have been in Canada for all I knew. I said, no. He said, well, apply, you never know. I got in. And then I spent 10 years of my life in Bristol, where there was a little shul. And on Shavuot, 1 year, halfway through my curriculum of nearly 6 years, they had an exam on Shavuot. And in those days I didn't write on Shabbat. And I went to the dean, I said, I'm sorry, I can't do this exam. He said, why not? So he said, my religion doesn't allow me to write. Oh, he said, well, you have to go to another medical school, won't you? Well, you can't do that. You can't change from one medical school. It's impossible. He said, oh, you have to go to Israel. And I was kicked out.
Because you wouldn't write on...
Because I wouldn't do an exam on Shavuot. Now, the professor of anatomy was Professor Joseph Mendel Yoffe. He was a Cohen. Why do I tell you he's a Cohen? How can a Cohen be professor of anatomy?
Halachically, whether...
Halachically. His father was a rabbi in Manchester, and they had a big best-in sort of argument about yes or no. He was determined to be an anatomist, and they had an agreement. If he learns every day, they will allow him to be an anatomist. And so he went to yeshiva, and he became a Talmudist, and he then went back to the dean and said, this guy can't, you must keep him, he's a good medical student. So I was allowed to do the exam a few days later, under promise not to cheat and so on, and that was it. And Professor Yoffe died in Jerusalem. He made Aliyah. He was a very famous anatomist, did a lot of research on lymphocytes, you know, one of the big things. Now everything's about lymphocytes. And his daughter, I met her, she was a kid when I was a medical student. She was deputy mayor of Jerusalem. And she was an important person in Jerusalem.
And when did you decide you wanted to do cardiology?
Right at the beginning. Right after qualifying. When you qualify, you've got so much potential in medicine, even then. But the first job I did was cardiology, and I just knew immediately.
And where did you do your speciality?
First, I started in Bristol, and then I came to London. I went to all the big hospitals. I was very lucky in my training. I was trained by very top people. And then in 68 or 69, I was at Hammersmith, which was then probably the leading cardiac centre in England. And Professor Goodwin sent me to Cape Town to work with Barnard.
Chris Barnard.
And I went there. I spent a year there. It was still apartheid, so I didn't really like being there too long. They wanted me to stay on. And I looked after Mr. Bleiberg, the dentist, the first successful transplant in the world.
You were there when they had the...
Yeah, I looked after him. And there was no echocardiography in South Africa. They didn't know it. And I had already been trained in England, so I bought a machine and I taught them echocardiography. So I introduced echocardiography in Cape Town in 1969.
I think there was Walensky. Walensky was, I think he had the first heart transplant.
Oh yeah, but he died within 3 weeks.
Yeah.
He was a black guy. And the other thing, this is medical, Bleiberg lived about a year and a half. And then when he died, he was given the heart of a young man. Bleiberg was already an elderly man. And he was given the heart of a very young person who died on the beach or something. And when they did the post-mortem on Bleiberg, that heart of the young man had become the heart of an old man. And when he got the heart 18 months before, there was no trouble with the coronary arteries. They were clean. By the time Bleiberg died 18 months later, the heart was full of atheroma.
Wow.
The coronary arteries were
clogged,
chock-a-block.
Romy, if you could read the inscription of Chris Barnard, which is...
This is Barnard's book, his memoirs. I must tell you, he was a great surgeon. He was not easy to work with. A lot of guys didn't like him. I got extremely well with him. I don't know why. I admired him. I'll tell you why. Well, apart from being a top surgeon, he made no difference between blacks and whites.
Yeah.
Everybody else did. If a white patient died, the black doctors weren't allowed into the post-mortem. It was that strict.
It changed when I got
this guy made no difference. To him, a human being, and I admired him for that. So this is his book, and this is what he gave me.
If you could read this wonderful inscription from Chris Barnard to you.
25th of November 1969. To Dr. Vecht, I hope you enjoyed your stay in Cape Town. It was a great pleasure having you here. My best wishes, Chris Barnard.
That's wonderful.
He was a very human boy. I loved him. And he developed arthritis and he couldn't work.
And his brother Marius, who was also...
Marius was part of the team, yeah, I knew Marius.
He was very...
Yeah, and I learned, look, the best training, I had a lot of good teachers, but the best training year in my life was in Cape Town. Because they had things that we don't get in Europe, like TB of the heart, big pericardial effusions, and I used to drain them. And they had rheumatic fever in young kids. Barnard used to take out a mitral valve in a kid of 7 with acute rheumatism. Things nobody could do in those days.
But it's amazing. It's like a circle that your grandfather spent time in Cape Town and you spent time in Cape Town.
Yes, and I found the house where they lived.
You found the house?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I've got a few documents to show you.
Before we do, I just want to thank you. I'm just going to come in a little. So Romeo, I just want to tell you this has been really the greatest honor and privilege. It's been absolutely There are no words. There really are no words.
Muscle.
And I am so extremely grateful to you. Your story and the miracles, and
miracle.
it is something absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah, and I used to ask myself, you know, as a kid, why were we allowed to survive? And all my Dutch family ended up in Auschwitz. And when I went to Auschwitz, years after, when it was still under Russian occupation, I went to the archives and I found, I think, 34 Vechts. You know, the Germans were meticulous.
To the detail.
To the detail. And there were 34 Vechts, all Auschwitz, and one that I've never forgotten, because there were no mobile cameras in those days. A little card like that. Vaartje Vecht. Vaartje is a Dutch girl. Age 16, Arrow, Mengele. And I asked myself, why did we survive?
I would like to ask you, what message do you impart to your children or grandchildren, or the future generations?
Well, anti-Semitism is here. It's virulent. I cannot believe that we're living again in a period reminiscent of the 1930s, when mostly the fascists were attacking the Jews. It's happening now in England. It's happening all over Europe, in America. Terrible anti-Semitism. I think Israel's slightly responsible for this because of the Palestinian problem. But basically, they just hate us. And, you know, I'm an old guy now. It's not going to hurt me. But I'm worried about my children and my grandchildren. Should they all go to Israel?
So Israel, it is, you know, I'd say they have now a government which is very inclusive of everyone.
Yeah.
But what you said, I'll just mention this because I'm here in London at our exhibition with many flags from different nations, and I have very close connections with Pakistani, the Iranian, with the UAE, from all over, Egyptian. I'm very close. When I came, all the flags were there, and when I came today, the Israeli flag was missing. Somebody had taken it down
we hear this
in the middle of London,
we hear this
Islington.
every day. There's some violent anti-Semitic event somewhere. Up north, in Scotland, everywhere.
But thank God we have Israel, and thank God.
Well, yes, of course. But you know, Israel is also not, well, certainly not what I thought I was going to find. You know, first of all, in Caesarea there was no religion. I couldn't believe that you go to a restaurant, you're offered pig meal. I mean, here we've struggled to keep kashrut during the war. Struggled to remain Jews amongst Germans. You go to Israel and they're eating chazir. I mean,
but there are many places, and things are changing. It really changes.
I was disappointed. I won't go into details. Now I want to show you some documents. I don't know if I can find it.
I just want to mention, and I have to put it, when we first came in Tel Aviv, it was difficult to find a kosher restaurant. Today there's so many in many different areas, and people you feel when there's a chag, or you feel the country feels it. You can be religious, irreligious, but you feel it's a very special country, Israel. And
oh, absolutely. But I'm worried about the politics. You know, the occupation, all that business. God knows what's going on. Do you read German?
From Yiddish I understand a little bit, but if you could read it or translate.
Well, it's German. It's German. It's from the Kommandatur, Feldgendarmerie, Antwerp, 30th of January 1941, Bescheinigung document. It's a permission.
Could you read it in German and then translate?
Eines Vorübergehen des Vorzuges des Philipp Vecht und seiner Ehefrau Henriette, geboren Benedikt, wohnhaft in Antwerpen, nach Spa zur Durchführung einer Kur bestehen diesseits keine Bedenken. In other words, the lieutenant of the Feldgendarmerie is allowing my father to undergo a cure in the city of Spa.
And this saved your lives and your
That
family's
document
life.
kept us going 4 years.
And do you know why? Why did they? Obviously, they thought maybe they could do a prisoner exchange or
Later.
but it's miracles.
So this one is a German major. Major Scheibler, Philipp Vecht, my father, his identity card. Das Verlassen des Wohnortes ohne Genehmigung des deutschen Militärischen ist verboten. That he is not allowed to leave Spa without military permission.
And these are the original documents.
Yes.
And you can see the Nazi insignia, the eagle with the swastika.
This is American GIs who came and liberated us. Photographs taken. This one here is a chap called Zunz. He was in the intelligence. He was a descendant of Leopold Zunz. This one is a major, a surgeon, all Jewish chaps, and he was treating an SS who was bleeding to death, and he said to the SS, "I'm going to give you a blood transfusion," and the SS says, "I don't want Jewish blood." He died. Told me the story. All Jewish boys. Herbert Tashan. I don't. They all died.
But what is amazing that he was prepared to treat the SS.
Well, you have to.
Yeah.
You have to. You know, Geneva Convention, all that business. I wonder if I can find that one letter. This will be interesting to you, but it's very long. It's an article in the Jewish Chronicle, 1907, a year before my grand. This picture is of the family Vecht, I think possibly in Argentina. A Jewish globetrotter.
Because in those days, to travel it was by ship. It wasn't a simple, and it took months. It took
all shipping.
Interview with Mr. A. Vecht in the Jewish Chronicle. In
Jewish Chronicle,
1907.
1907.
Wow, amazing. Zoom in onto the picture.
So say when I can turn.
Okay, shoots. Thanks so much.
Now then I'm going to show you something very interesting. Years after the war, my sister and I, we used to go to Spa to remember, you know, what happened there. And I went to the Hotel de Ville. There was a guy there. Romeo! We played football together as a kid.
Wow.
And he had kept this and he gave it to me. That is a stamp which says Juif in French and Yod.
Wow.
And that stamp was in every Jewish identity card or passport. This is the original stamp. And to show you what it's all about, I found this. And that's that. This was the chief rabbi of Liège. I told you Liège was a big city. And this is a Belgian identity card. And you had this big thing.
So this could have been, this was the original.
Yeah, this is the original, yeah. Yeah.
This is priceless.
Yeah. Can't be many of those left now. This guy actually survived the war. He went to Auschwitz, ended up in Canada. Now I've got to decide where I give it before I die.
Which will be in many, many years to come.
Well, please God, but you never know. And so
Maybe it should stay within the family.
No. No. There's too many kids and grandchildren. They're not interested. They're not interested.
You never know. It's
It either
this
has
is
to go to Yad Vashem or to the Imperial War Museum, depending on my mood.
Romeo. This is unbelievable. I mean, you have. You know, people collect items, but you have the originals, and you're with your family.
That was sheer luck.
And look over here. But would you have recognized
What?
when you met the boy that you once played soccer with?
He was much older than me. Much older. But if you come to the other room, can you come with your camera?
Yeah.
I've got some documents to show you. This goes back in there. That stays here.
So this is in the Jewish Chronicle.
2007. He just
The Jewish Globetrotter, and
he went to Argentina and saw the poor Jews.
and then a year later
And then he died. And this is his obituary in the Jewish Chronicle of November 1908. That's his obituary.
He was a very young man when he died.
54.
Oh.
And this is the picture of family in Australia. That's my dad.
They must have been one of the first very firm families in Australia.
Yes. And in the book, which I have somewhere, it says, where's that book? No. I don't know if it's here or in my other library. This is a book written by Professor Rutland. She's an Australian historian. And this is a story of the Jews in Australia. It was not until 1902 that the New South Wales and Victorian Zionist League were formed. In 1903, Australia had two representatives at the Sixth Zionist Congress, R. Beards and Aaron Vecht, the latter having returned to Europe. So he was, and somewhere in this book she says that he started Zionism in
Australia.
In Australia, yeah. Where did I find this? The problem is everybody fiddles around with my books, all my children.
But Romeo, what's very interesting from your family, Aria Linka, you've got a large family in Israel, and the Freudmans, very well known, and
yes, I know. 87, 88 and 90. 87. 87. The first Zionist organization in Australia was a short-lived Chovevei Zion, which held in its initial meeting in the home of Louis Barnett of Sydney. The chairman, who was an immigrant from Russia, explained that the goals of the association were the colonization of Palestine and the preservation of Hebrew. The impetus for this movement may have come from an English Jew, Aaron Vecht, who had been a committee member of the Chovevei Zion movement in London.
it's incredible.
Started in Australia. So there you go.
Romeo, this has been
I hope you enjoyed it.
unbelievable. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate
Maybe,
it.
don't you think it's enough?
It's wonderful. It's never enough. We could go on for hours and hours, but
Yeah,
it's
you
been
could.
very special. Thank you so much.
I've understood.
In Islington.
Take your finger away, it's what so.
In Islington.
Islington,
In New Zealand.
New Zealand. Look at the staff.
There were many employers. Wow.
And this is, I'll show the factory. I'll have to have, this is, look,
What's on this?
this is all the meat.
No, he's got to see that sitting down.
Look at the
Romeo.
factory.
No, it's good. It's
You have to see it properly.
And this is a picture
It's unbelievable.
of the rabbi.
that. What's your first name?
This.
yeah. Loading frozen. Loading the food.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, but it's all packed. And this guy is a shomer, or the rabbi. And the whole question of kashrut came in. And this is going on a ship.
You have to see the whole album, believe me.
No, it's falling apart. Islington, New Zealand.
Islington, New Zealand.
That's the factory. And it was Vecht and Stockfish, New Zealand. I had to show you this.
Romeo, thank you so
Till we
much.
meet again.
Wow. So just in mazel and brocha and in good health.
Yeah, well, we do our best.
And thank you so much. Really, I'm so extremely grateful.
Now we